Hello and welcome to Welty at Home. We are the slow reading virtual book club that alternates works by Eudora Welty with works by authors connected to Welty. We are currently discussing a selection of works by Welty and others inspired by the civil rights leader Medgar Evers. Today we are discussing The Demonstrators by Eudora Welty. This short story isn't about Evers directly, but it paints a portrait of his era in Mississippi. I'm Jessica Russell, director of the Eudora Welty House and Garden. We are grateful to Suzanne Mars, Eudora Welty's friend and biographer and our friend, and Professor Emerita of Millsaps College for guiding these discussions. Just some quick housekeeping: to comment or ask a question, be sure to click the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and click the raise hand function. So Suzanne and I will be looking for your raised hands, and we always try to get you in the order that you raise them. Be sure to also take a glance at the chat every now and then. There's usually a great discussion paralleling the verbal discussion in the chat, so be sure to not miss that. In fact, I'm going to kick off the chat in just a moment. I've learned that if I do this too soon, not everybody gets it, but in just a moment, I'm going to put a resource that Suzanne shared by fellow Welty at Home member John Hennigan. It's an article he wrote concerning Mississippi in 1965 when Eudora was writing The Demonstrators, just for more context on that. So I'll be sharing that shortly in the chat. And for now, Suzanne, shall we begin today's discussion?
Let's go.
All right.
I want to start off just by telling you, I had a note from Frank X. Walker, who loved being with you and who wanted to let me know he has a new book out. And his new book is called Love House, and it's available from Accents Publishing. So if you're interested in Frank X. Walker's new book, it's Love House from Accents Publishing. Okay. I've ordered it, so I'll give you my review maybe next time if the book shows up on my doorstep. It's not available as a Kindle, so I can't have it instantaneously. All right, let me talk a little bit about The Demonstrators before we begin our discussion. Eudora wrote The Demonstrators in 1965, 2 years after Medgar Evers had died. Her agent sent it to the New Yorker in November of 1965, and the magazine immediately and enthusiastically accepted the story. William Maxwell, the fiction editor and Eudora's friend, loved it. William Shawn loved it. So they were planning to publish the story. And so William Maxwell, friend, fiction editor, called Eudora to talk to her about it. And she didn't answer. And so they had a long correspondence, and so over the years, and so he just sent her a note, and she didn't respond to that. And then he had galleys for it, the first set of galleys, and he sent those to her on December 1st, and she wrote him a letter on December 1st, so those crossed in the mail. And then she did get the galleys and respond to that, but she was explaining to him why she had not been responding, why she hadn't answered the phone, why she hadn't responded to his letter. And the reasons were very serious family matters that had to be attended to. Her brother Edward had fallen and broken his neck and was in the hospital. Her mother had had a stroke when she was in residence in Yazoo City at the Martha Coker nursing home and was hospitalized there. So her brother and her mother were both in very serious condition, hospitalized 50 miles apart, and she was driving back and forth and seeing to both of them, along with Edward's wife, Eleanor, who was with him. So she got the galleys, and she did go over them, and she appreciated Maxwell's suggestions about what needed to be done for them. But her trials were not over. On January 20th, 1966, her mother died, Justina Welty died, and 4 days later, on January 24th, 1966, her brother Edward, her younger brother Edward, died. And the result was, of course, a devastated Eudora Welty, stricken by grief, feeling at a loss for words, feeling unable to concentrate on work. And perhaps it's for this reason, I don't know, but the New Yorker delayed publication of the story. But by October of 1966, they were ready to go, and Bill Maxwell sent Eudora the final galleys of the story to go over it, and sent his suggestions for revision. They were planning to publish it on November the 5th, and then something happened. They didn't have room for it in the November 5th issue, and it was published on December 10th, 1966. So a year after she had completed it. She worried that the context might have blurred in the time, that the story might not address the social situation as directly as she had hoped it would. But then she said she thought that was not the case. It still spoke to the moment, and so the story was published. When her friend Mary Lou Aswell, also a fiction editor, a former fiction editor at Harper's Bazaar, read the story, she wrote to Eudora and said how much she liked it, how much she admired it. And Eudora replied, "It was a difficult story because I wanted to show, however imperfectly, what it's like today. I called it The Demonstrators because I feel that's what everybody is reduced to being." So I thought I might begin just by talking about what it was like in Mississippi in 1964 and 65. 1964, as you know, and as John Hennigan talked about earlier, was Freedom Summer here. Many civil rights workers in Mississippi working to help try to register voters. 3 of them, Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, were murdered. 40 Black churches were firebombed. Many white Mississippians suffered lesser burdens, being ostracized if they dared to be civil, cordial to African Americans or to civil rights workers from the North who had come to Mississippi. But in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. In 1965, and John Hennigan has an essay about 1965, which Jessica has posted in the chat, I think, which gives you a good summary of 1965. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was actively engaged in trying to register people to vote, and trying to support the Voting Rights Act. And John, you're going to correct me if I get any of this wrong. I'm counting on you. And in Jackson, they held a march on June 14th, which resulted in the arrest of demonstrators. And then marches continued over the next 2 weeks. And eventually, 1,000 people were arrested and taken to livestock pens at the state fairgrounds, kept there in deplorable conditions, kind of terrorized by guards who evidently, according to Ed King, the guards told them that they were going to gas them, and then they sprayed them with DDT. So that's a kind of mental torture as well as the physical torture of being there. On June 30th, a 3-judge panel from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals enjoined the city of Jackson from making any further arrest and ordered that those arrested be released. So later in 1965, that summer, the Voting Rights Act was passed. Medgar Evers' hopes for change, the hopes for which he had died, were only haltingly being made. A couple of other little background bits of information. You remember that the civil rights worker visits the Stricklands in their home, and Dr. Strickland upbraids him for saying that he was arrested for that civil rights workers had been arrested for picking cotton in June in Mississippi. And he says, there's no cotton to be picked in June. There was an article in the Jackson Daily News on June 1st, 1961, about just such a claim by a civil rights worker. And I've tried to find this in my memory. I remember, Susan, you might help me too. Susan Sands Jones. I remember Eudora telling me about a young son of a friend of hers came to visit her, and she took him to a restaurant. I suppose it's no longer in business, but I'll leave it unnamed. She took him to a restaurant for lunch, and they were turned away because he had long hair, and I must presume because he had a northern accent. Eudora never returned to that restaurant. I don't know what year that was. I thought I put it in the biography, but I couldn't find it. So it's something I once knew, and I'm giving to you in imperfect form here. But that was the sort of atmosphere, and that persisted in the state of Mississippi. I know I had friends who told me that they met at each other's houses. They gathered just so they could talk openly. They didn't feel free to talk in public about the repressive, oppressive, dangerous atmosphere of the state. Okay, so a little background information. John or Susan, anything to add there? Oops. Yeah, John.
I don't remember what year this was, but I think one of the remarkable things that happened during that time period, and it was done at Aaron Henry's request. There was a group of women, and primarily white women, who recorded every time that the local news station, TV stations, would not broadcast stories about civil rights. And a test pattern would come on the TV, local TV, and I think this was the ABC station. I may be wrong about that, but they actually lost their license with the FCC because they were not broadcasting stories about the civil rights movement across the country. And the people who, again, the people who documented this information was a group of white women in Jackson, Mississippi, who recorded and filled out affidavits about the times when these stories were not being broadcast, and the the TV station lost its license with the FCC because of that work on behalf of those women did at Aaron Henry's request.
Thanks, John. Susan, do you remember that story Eudora told us about?
I kind of vaguely remember, but I think it could have easily happened. I was only 12 in 64, so but I guess I always feel like we should say, like, my dad was on a board with Bishop Laws, and there were white businessmen and priests helping to make sure the people could register to vote in Catholic churches all over the state, and worrying about the follow-up to the burnings. And then there were a group of women, probably some of the same women that John, my mother was from the North, and there were a lot of medical doctors' wives, but there was a group called Wednesdays in Mississippi where they had national women, black and white, come and spend the night at our house because they stayed in my room, so I had to move, and came for one day. And it made her so mad. One of the ladies came that was a prominent woman from New York City and said she was more scared in Jackson than she had been in Moscow. And they put it in the New York Times, and Mother was so mad because she had worked she had all these children to take care of and entertain the woman. So I guess what's important for people to know is there were people working, on the other side, which, but it was a hard time. And they also, the woman that had the weekly newspaper, the stories weren't in the Clarion Ledger. John, what was the name of that? The weekly paper that the woman, I'll think of it. But anyway, there were,
Yeah.
you know,
You're not talking about Hazel Brannon Smith.
yes, yes.
Lexington, yeah.
And
Yep.
see, we got that weekly paper and Daddy made sure we read it.
Mhm.
And we still got the Sunday New York Times. So, I mean, there were, you know, people on the other side, but it was a hard time. So anyway, I'll be
Yeah,
quiet.
I would say if you were Black and engaged in the civil rights movement, your life was in danger. If you were white, you were certainly your life might not be in danger, but it wasn't the case of Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman. But you were subject to things like the Hefners in Macomb, a book called Why the Hefners Left Macomb, about how they were he was driven out of business, and their dog was killed, they were ostracized in the community, and this because they had a young civil rights worker visit in their house. So that was it, you know. So difficult times, people of conscience, both Black and white taking stands, and a real spirit of bitterness and intractability, as the story says. Okay, let's talk about the Demonstrators. And I thought we might talk about it in 3 parts, and I'll try to be sure we don't miss the last part. So I'm going to try to keep track on my watch, and Jessica will watch me too. I want to start with a short section, just the first one, because I want to talk about why does the story begin this way with Dr. Strickland's visit to Miss Marcia Polk. So Saturday night, 11 o'clock, the doctor is just getting home from having visited Miss Marcia Polk, just getting to his office from having visited Miss Marcia Polk. Why do you think the story begins in this fashion? Anyone want to start us off? It's short enough I could read it. Near 11 o'clock that Saturday night, the doctor stopped again by his office. He had recently got into playing a weekly bridge game at the club, but tonight it had been interrupted for the 3rd time, and he'd just come from attending to Miss Marcia Pope. Now bedridden, scorning all medication, and in particular tranquilizers, she had a seizure every morning before breakfast and often on Saturday night for some reason, but had retained her memory. She could amuse herself by giving out great wads of Shakespeare, and then I'm not going to read the Latin because I'll mispronounce it, or the like. The more forcefully Miss Marcia Pope declaimed, the more innocent grew her old face. The lines went right out of it. She'll sleep naturally, I think, he had told the companion, still in her rocker. Mrs. Warham did well, perhaps hadn't yet hit on an excuse to quit that suited her. She failed to be alarmed by Miss Marcia Pope, either in convulsions or in recitation. From where she lived, she had never gone to school to this lady, who had taught 3 generations of Holden, Mississippi, its Latin, civics, and English, and who had carried for 40 years a leather satchel bigger than the doctor's bag. As he had snapped his bag shut tonight, Miss Marcia had opened her eyes and spoken distinctly. "Richard Strickland, I have it on my report that Irene Roberts is not where she belongs. Now, which of you wants the whipping?" "It's all right, Miss Marcia. She's still my wife," he had said, but could not be sure the answer got by her. Okay, so here's a story about mainly about Dr. Strickland's visit to the Black community of Holden, Mississippi, but it starts out here. Why do you think, Susan?
I think she's setting up the comparison, also having us know that he is the small town doctor that will make home calls at this time. But the fact that this white woman was consistent in something that really wasn't that hard, he could have told somebody else to take the medicine, and comparing that to not getting to the African-American wounded person until they're so sick. And then the second one, to kind of setting up how things were different on the other side of the tracks, kind of.
Okay. Yeah, I hadn't thought about, he goes as soon as he's called.
Right.
He goes to, and he goes to both of them at 11 o'clock at night or later.
On Saturday, yes.
On Saturday night. And so here's a doctor making house calls, attending both Black and white patients, but there's something different about the way he attends them. Yeah, I think. Harriet?
I think it also sets up an equal authority to the doctor at the beginning, who is challenging his success in his marriage, and is ready to it introduces that issue for us. That is what is happening in the doctor's personal life, and what is is he in charge in the way that his position might suggest.
All right, yeah. So a challenge to his authority, and that authority is going to be challenged when he gets to Ruby Gaddy's bedside as well. So she's saying, which of you wants the whipping? Yeah. So she's got the teacher's authority left over from high school. Yeah. Marcia, welcome back.
Hello?
Welcome.
Yeah, I've been gone, yeah. Here, I looked up the Latin, which I did not know, and it's the first words of Virgil's Aeneid,
Mm-hmm.
of arms and the man I sing. And I think that too is relevant for the themes of the story.
Yes, very relevant. When I went with Eudora, when the BBC crew was here filming her, we went down to Davis School and they wanted her to write on the board. And this is what she wrote on the board that she had memorized. Yeah, so
She wrote this
very quotation. Yeah.
Oh,
the blackboard for the BBC to record.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, it sort of sums up the situation.
Yeah.
The situation that she's going to sing in her story.
Yeah. And so Miss Marcia Pope may not be thinking about the current situation, but her quote is very relevant to it. Yeah. What else? Anything else here? I think the doctor's tone with Miss Marcia Polk, is very different from the tone he takes with the African American people. When he goes in to see them, he's going to be commanding. He's do this, do that, give me some water, boil water. He's just, he's not deferential. He's deferential to his former teacher, to the white woman, but not to those African Americans that he goes to treat. And the other thing I wanted to point out was Miss Marcia Polk won't take tranquilizers, but Dr. Strickland, when he's watching the grass fire, it's like an anesthetic made visible. He needs some sort of anesthetic. And the African American citizens of this town need anesthesia as well, but they're taking paregoric. That's the drug they can get sold under the title Mother's Helper. So that whole question of anesthesia, also a question of social class. Mrs. Warham and Miss Polk, too. I think that question is being raised. Anything else? I think maybe that we also have Dr. Strickland's nostalgia for the past, in a sense that Miss Polk is the teacher he's paid attention to. He feels somewhat nostalgic about it. And he's nostalgic for the old paternalistic social order, I think, as we're going to see. Yeah, Beverly.
Well, this doesn't really speak to that question, but when I finished rereading the story, I thought what a nice little package she had set up, because we start with Miss Pope and then we end with Miss Pope being able to take care of herself. So I think, again, we've got that contrast between her and her situation and the situation that the doctor goes into and has to deal with. So I think that was brilliant on Miss Eudora's part.
Structurally, yeah, great. Yeah, and also the issues it raises of self-determination, self-sufficiency, and whether she thought she was self-sufficient. Okay, let's move on to Dr. Strickland's visit to Ruby Gaddy. And this is too long for me to read, so I'll let you bring up what you would like to talk about in this section. So a child comes for him. He goes and he calls on Ruby Gaddy, who has been stabbed with an ice pick. What stands out to you about this house call at 11 at night? Cheryl.
So this is kind of technical, or based upon the contemporary times. I don't understand why there would be guinea pigs running around the house. And when we read The Wide Net, there was the guinea pig in, not Clyde, Libby's story.
Yeah.
Libby, right? So I don't know if people had guinea pigs running around their house in the 1940s. So if someone could just.
Of course, this story is set in the 60s, but in the 1940s, they definitely did, because Eudora talks about it when she went to the house of an African-American fortune teller, and the guinea pigs were running through the house. And so, and I think there's a picture of a little boy. I think she has a picture of a little boy with a guinea pig. So it was common. And I think she's picked up on that detail to sort of make the atmosphere seem more vivid, perhaps,
Okay.
than it would have otherwise. I don't know if we're talking about guinea pigs as experimental animals here. If there's any, does anyone see any significance, Harriet?
Yeah, I think that we haven't gotten into talking about the medical aspects of the story, but I think that there's that suggestion that we're in a world which is full of stories about guinea pig applications of on Black bodies. I'm thinking of this Tuskegee experiment, or the stories of Marion J. Sims discovering, making breakthroughs in women's medicine, but performing, this is in much earlier times, performing his experiments on slave women in order to make those breakthroughs without anesthetic. And so there's just the suggestion of a history of medicine that's not savory.
Yeah, I was thinking of Fannie Lou Hamer as well. So, what else about this scene at Ruby Gaddy's bedside? What else stands out to anyone? Want to talk about anything here? Yeah, Gilbert.
Well, what stood out to me was the lack of emergency or urgency on it. You know, the woman's been stabbed in the chest, and he doesn't seem to be treating as a real live modern. Well, I know this is before the trauma center days, but it seems like that ought to be treated more like an emergency than go get me some boiled water.
Yeah. He's really treating it as just something. Well, let's manage the pain, but there's no effort really to save her. She's not taken to a hospital.
There's also a strong element in this story, and also with Dove killing, that it's just the way life works for Black people.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I think the whole flavor of this is, like old Jimmy Buffett's a Cuban crime of passion. That's just the way those people live.
I think the doctor, he shows absolute lack of urgency. Now, the fact of the matter is, he could not have gotten an ambulance for her at that time. In 1965, when Medgar Evers was shot, there was no ambulance. They put him in the back of a station wagon and on a mattress and carried him to the hospital. So how he would, Billy Lee Warham is going to go by ambulance, but it would have been impossible to take Ruby Gaddy by ambulance. But Strickland doesn't say, okay, who's got a car? Then there would be the question of where.
Yeah, I was going to say
where to go. There were Black hospitals in the Delta, but they were a long way from where this would have been. The Taborian Hospital was a really long way from where it would have been. They could have gone to Jackson. Billy Lee Warham is taken to Jackson. If you go to Jackson, then where are you going to be treated? I suppose you would do as they did with Medgar Evers, go to the University Hospital, but there would be problems being admitted. There would be delays. So it's almost like Dr. Strickland has given up any sense of trying any heroic measure just deal with the situation as it is. We'll see what happens. We'll make her comfortable. We'll try to prevent infection, and that's it. And there's a kind of resignation and a lack of urgency, and it's a kind, as you say, Joubert, there's a kind of racial prejudice here. What happens to the young white man who's injured on the highway? He's taken to a hospital. What happens to Ruby Gaddy? She is going to be made as comfortable as he can make her, and that's it. Yeah. Susan.
Yeah, I was interested in what he does and what he thinks when he first gets to her. The young, very black-skinned woman lay in a white dress with her shoes on. A maid, he thinks. Then he saw that, of course, the white is not the starched material of a uniform, but shiny, clinging stuff. And there was a banner of some kind crossing it in a crumpled red line from the shoulder. And then he gets, starts getting the clothes out of the way, but he makes these assumptions, pretty much all the way through about what he expects based on the roles he sees people playing. And then later on, when he's leaving, he gets a glimpse all at once of a row of dresses hung up across the front of a house, starched until they could have stood alone, and in an instant had recognized his mother's gardening dress, his sister's Annie's golf dress, his wife's favorite duster. I'm not sure if this is reality here, that he's really seeing those, or if this is in his mind. But it's interesting the way he keeps seeing women and women's clothes in terms of roles that they play.
Yeah, and he doesn't even recognize Ruby. She's the maid in his building, but he doesn't know that it's Ruby. And finally, it comes to him. He doesn't. If he doesn't see people in their role, playing their role, he can't recognize them. So I think, yeah. And that business about the clothes, well, these ladies would be taking in laundry, so they would have taken care of the family laundry. But his mother is dead. His wife has moved away. His sister has moved away. So if these are their clothes, they've been their gifts, or he's just looking back to the past. And I think with some longing, these were the good old days. Yeah. These were the days when we sent our laundry to these people and they starched them too much, but it was that, and that's the days when somebody brings you a cup of water, it comes in a teacup that could have been your mother's, so it's like the giving people the cast off things.
But it also gets at the roles these women played, right? His mother's gardening dress, his sister's golf dress, his wife's favorite duster that she wore to the breakfast table. Again, these are sort of leisure activities rather than the maid's uniform.
Yeah, as opposed to the women who are taking in laundry and serving as maids in people's houses and businesses. Yeah. Harriet.
I want to get in more detail on the interaction between the women in this house and the doctor. We talked about the questions that he asks. They're accusations. I'm listing them here. Too much excitement to send for a doctor a little earlier. Have you touched her? What the devil's running in here? You got a fire on here? Can you ever hush that baby? And in reaction, it seems like the women stand firm and turn the tables on him, so that they ask that question that's so important. Don't you know her? As if he was never going to hit on the right question. And then as if she'd spoken, he recognized her, though merely as the woman who cleans his office. That is, he can't see her for the invisibility of her labor. But his response to her is, Ruby, this is Dr. Strickland. What have you been up to? Kind of blaming the victim. And then this quick choral response of Ruby's encircling female network is nothing as they respond to him. And so I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about the moment when Lucille, who is maybe Ruby's mother, sticks a hot lamp and her own cross-examination into the doctor's face, reversing the direction of allegations and suggesting just what we've said, that he does not doing enough. And then he pulls medical authority and he says, why, she's bleeding inside. What do you think she's doing? I gave her a shot. She'll just go to sleep. If she doesn't, call me back and I'll give her another one. That movement to not to treatment, but to anesthesia and a kind of failure of expectation that he can save her. And I'm thinking about that too in relationship to the other women in the story, like his wife and his daughter and his situation in life of not being able to imagine or able to save. So it's a personal question for him. It's also a race. It's also in the story, which is so much about reading race. Is a racial issue.
Yeah, he is peremptory with them. And some might say, all doctors out there, forgive me, that the doctor's kind of arrogance comes through here, but it's more than that. It's a racial. He feels free to treat them in this way. And the difference may be that they feel free from the past, and what he liked better was the old system. They feel free to challenge him, just as Miss Marcia Polk has challenged him. And they're fighting, they're speaking back. Yeah. Cheryl, I thought you had your hand up. Did you change your mind?
Well, the conversation is just so incredible, and we're bouncing between different things. I think that, well, I know because I'm writing my notes. One thing I was thinking about is that his name is Dove.
Yeah.
But it's Dave. And I think that by this point, everyone knows I'm fascinated by Eudora Welty's use of birds in her fiction. But what Harriet or Susan just said, I'm prompted to wonder, how much can you do for other people in different socioeconomic classes? Must a writer crusade, or must an ordinary person crusade to, if we're in the 1960s or pre-civil rights era, how much of my life and my family's life can I sacrifice to help other people? And in current times, how much of my life and my son's life can I sacrifice to help? I'm not trying to launch us into a discussion on this, but like something like LGBTQ rights, and so the power of this writing is it forces us to look at ourselves and ask that question: how much can you do, and can you do more?
Yeah.
For me personally.
And I think that the feeling for Dr. Strickland's feeling about himself is that I can't do anymore. He's given up. And at some point, he has given up.
And how much do we blame him? He's lost a daughter. He's part of a legacy he was born into. His dad was a doctor. Now he's the doctor. He was married and he lost a child who I guess was paraplegic.
Yeah, she's never been able to sit up or walk from birth. So, yeah, so there's been that tragedy in his own family, the personal tragedy. There's the social tragedy that plays out. And there is that sense of loss. I think there are lots of questions in here, Cheryl, it seems to me, that aren't answered. It's very typical of a Welty story in a sense. And there's that sense. And, Maynard Mack, when he was writing about Hamlet, said Hamlet is written in the interrogative mood. Well, this story is really written in the interrogative mood too. Here, there are questions throughout that are never answered. Why have Ruby and Dove been arguing? What has led to this tragedy? We don't know. Why hasn't he been sent for earlier? That's not answered. Why doesn't he do more? That's not answered. Why is his daughter stricken at birth in this way? All of these questions are there, and it's the terms of our existence, that kind of mystery at the heart of experience with which we have to cope. I think, Beverly.
I think in relation to what Cheryl said, you know, we have these questions and he has all this to deal with, but in addition, he also has the legacy of his father. Yeah. And the idea that he's not the doctor that his father was. Now, his father probably did not have these same kind of scenarios to deal with. Probably his father in years before dealt with the Miss Popes of the world, and he was revered, and you know, there were not questions. Whereas when he walks into this situation in Ruby's house, I was surprised that he was not shown more respect by the family members that were gathered there. I mean, they do challenge him, and they don't do what he says, and he has to ask more than once, and then sometimes they just completely ignore him. So in addition to the problems with his wife, who seems to be maybe moving toward more acceptance of the civil rights movement because she's got this young man who came into their house. And then he's got the daughter who died, and the wife is dealing with that. He's also got to deal with probably feels very much like failures on his part because he is not the doctor that his father was. And that's you know, without criticizing him, you know, I don't know what kind of doctor he was except for this one incident. And we do know he didn't really do much. He doesn't seem to be terribly concerned about the fact that Ruby's going to die.
Yeah, and it's another psychological problem he has. You sure it's your daddy, the son who can't live up to the father who's preceded him, and that sense of inadequacy. I think the wife is an interesting question that, she has given all, once she loses her daughter, she gives all to an idea. And we have a sense that idea is the civil rights movement. At least Dr. Strickland thinks it is. But then we know she's gone, and by reports in her hometown, they're all giving parties for her. She's off leading a kind of social life in her hometown. Well, that doesn't sound like the person committed to the civil rights movement, but all of this is filtered to us from Strickland, who may be seeing it in a distorted fashion as he sees the Black community in the distorted fashion. And so there's another ambiguity in the story, I think. Yeah, Cheryl.
And so when I was thinking about tying it all together from where is the voice coming from to Margaret Walker and the Frank X. Walker poems, and then this story, I also have had the wonderful opportunity to be reading A Curtain of Green with my Goodreads book club. So the story of Keela, the outcast Indian maiden, and the chickens that appear in that story. When I went to read the Demonstrators and I saw or read about the
chickens
Dr. Strickland,
yeah.
Right. And but the thing is, in Keela the Outcast Maiden, Eudora Welty sets little Leroy up to be kind of judge and jury. He's at the top of the porch. The chickens are on like steps 2 and 3, and then the 2 white men are at the bottom, and they're discussing things. And the conversation that Miss Welty invites is the conversation that she continues to invite throughout her career. And it just it resonates so much with me, that story with the demonstrators that she wrote like almost 30 years later. And that's it.
Yeah, and the dismissive way little Leroy is treated is also relevant here, I think. Okay, Harriet.
I was just thinking that we're putting a lot of emphasis on reading and understanding the doctor. But as a reader, I find myself wanting to read and understand Ruby's situation. I mean, I do read this as a murder mystery in which there is a reveal, and the reveal is the doctor's anesthetic, not the story of what has happened to Ruby. And then we get this newspaper article. We've had the newspaper evoked several times in the story. It's on the walls of the house in a way that suggests the body as in the context of texts that you read, and then we get this terrible, almost comically satiric newspaper treatment of the death of two Black individuals, that is in the Sentinel, a name that suggests a kind of control, but the headline is "Two Dead, One Ice Pick, Freak Episode at Negro Church, No Racial Content Espied." And then the report is all muddled and contradictory. Dove is reported to have died with a chest wound, but also of a wound from the ear or the eye. He's called Dave rather than Dove. He's reportedly wounded by Ruby after wounding her outside the church, but the murder weapon is found in the far off site of the Negro school. There's no explanation for how it got there. We can't rely on the newspaper. What happens is that people do, I think, begin to feel that there was a plot that you understand through the newspaper article, but you can't rely on this newspaper article for anything. And so I'm just thinking about how I want to know Ruby's story. This reminds me of Faulkner's story about Nancy and Jesus. I'm blocking for the moment, that evening sun, where I want to understand Ruby's story, but I've got Quentin's point of view, and it's white, and it's never going to know what the story really is. And here we have the story from the doctor's point of view, and and the newspaper, and we're never going to know what the story is of Ruby and Dove, with the suggestion that maybe there are kind of hints of things that we wonder about, like the mill and employment and institutionalized racism and pressures that are external to this couple, but we're not going to know Ruby, and yeah.
That's right. I think the newspaper is a marvelous satiric piece. They get everything wrong. Where did Dove die? They say he died in front of Dr. Strickland's office. He didn't. The doctor has gone around. It's not at his office. What was Dove's name? Dave, they call him, not Dove. You were mentioning there are inaccuracies all over the place. And then they want to be sure that they get in the white point on civil rights. We white people are being mistreated. Those Black people have gotten $100,000 school. Not to mention they've been denied literacy, and the schools are horrible and they don't have good textbooks. No, that's not what it's about. And they can't blame us for this one. And they want to be seated in our churches. So there's all this kind of racist, white supremacist tone to the newspaper article. They can't get the facts right. They can't even get the name of one of the victims right. And so here is the media being taken. So Dr. Strickland can't recognize what's going on. the newspapers can't recognize what's going on. And we're not going to know. We're denied that, so that there's that real sense of white, what's the right word?
Blindness.
Blindness, yeah. Anything, and by the way, the newspaper also article can't be written grammatically either. So it's Miss Marcia Polk would not like this article. Should have her red pen all over it. So what else about the newspaper article? Anything else? So this is a small town newspaper. It's taking that small town newspaper to task, but the Jackson newspaper wasn't too much better. Wasn't any more, it might be slightly more accurate. It might be slightly more grammatical, but it's equally wrong-headed. Anything else here about the newspaper article? Okay, Harriet, what do you make of this? So you want the story. You're not wanting the story to do it, but you think the story leaves us with a sense that the white people of Holden, Mississippi are never going to know their African-American neighbors. They are blind. Here's the last, let's look at the last. John, you first, and then I'll read the last section.
This is about the newspaper article, and it's I hope I can be coherent about this. And the title, The Demonstrators. I mean, to me, the newspaper article is almost like a Greek chorus, and the whole story is. I mean, it's incredible to me how she can recreate a segregated society, a totally segregated society, and bring it to me to life about how it must have been. You know, there's no ambulance. The ambulance is never called, but the marshal's already been there and investigated, and goes back. And it seems the only thing that people are concerned about is if this had been a white on black killing, then it would have been about race, and they would have done something differently. But it's not about race. It's a black on black killing, and they're gonna not treat it in the same way that if it had been another type of killing. And you know, it's related to, you know, the most, I think we've all heard this, the most segregated hour in Mississippi is during church these days. That's the most segregated hour in Mississippi. Back then, everything was segregated. And it's like y'all pointed out, when he goes into the room where Ruby is in bed, which is only occupied by women and Ruby's sister and her child, you know, he is on their turf. They don't acknowledge that he is their equal, and they are as a person. I'm not talking about any other way, but as a person. And so they're gonna give him a rough time for, in their mind, he's not even interested in who he's tending to. But you could make the argument that what he's trying to do is try to treat her, and treat her as quickly as he could, as he can. But again, within the confines of a totally segregated society where, you know, again, this injury wasn't sufficient for the marshal who has been to investigate what happened for the, you know, let me say that these days, and this is what it seems to me, and a point I'm trying to make, these days, the police would have been responsible for making sure that the ambulance was going to get somebody who was about to die to a hospital. It wouldn't be the doctor's responsibility. The doctor would be at the hospital, particularly for some kind of injury like this. But the marshal doesn't even think that this is significant. So anyway,
John, another thing that struck me is when Dr. Strickland comes in, and I give him credit for coming, but what does he ask about? Who did this? He asked about the crime. Has the marshal been called? He's concerned with the legal rather than before he's almost concerned with the medical. I think he has just acquiesced into the system. Yeah.
But you could say that he wants to know, possibly he wants to know what's happened so he can get a better understanding of her injuries.
That's what I thought.
And to try to find out how, well, just to get a better understanding of what her injuries were. And I think he thought possibly the people in the room, some of the people in the room at least, had that information and may have been actually eyewitnesses, because that could help him expedite whatever kind of treatment he was going to give to the patient. But I've got a bias here because I've got a son who's a doctor and learned, I think I know a little bit about what's on their mind when they're focused on treating the patient. Can I say I thought one of the best, one of my favorite lines in this story, and it may be in everything she's written, it's on 611 of the collected stories, the line "look equaled look, sisters," describing the exchange. I just thought that was a beautiful line. And really captured what can happen between kinfolk,
And I think there's a line similar to that in Delta Wedding. So anyway, let's look just at the very end. We have a second. Dr. Strickland has gone out to his back porch, screened-in porch, I think, and the porch was at the back of the house, screened on 3 sides. Sylvia's daybed used to stand here. It put her in the garden. No other houses were in sight. The gin could not be heard, or even the traffic whining on the highway up off the bypass. And then he talks about how ruined the garden is, everything, the flickers are still there. He was pretty sure that Sylvia had known the birds were there. Her eyes would follow birds when they flew across the garden. As he watched the cock spread one wing, showy as a zebra's hide, and with a turn of his head, show his red seal. Dr. Strickland swallowed the coffee and picked up his bag. It was all going to be just about as hard as seeing Herman and Eva Fairbrother's through. He thought that in all Holden as of now, only Miss Marcia Pope was still quite able to take care of herself, or such was her own opinion. What do you make of that way of closing the story? Beverly's pointed out to us the reference to Miss Marcia Pope, which balances the reference at the first, and it's Miss Marcia Pope, only Miss Marcia Pope is able to take care of herself, or such was her own opinion. In other words, not even Miss Marcia Pope is able to take care of herself. Yeah, Harriet?
I hear you asking about Marcia Pope in the end. I want to focus more on the garden, the alien pear tree, this ruined landscape that we've been focusing on as
say a wasteland.
Yeah, and the aridity and the clanging of the empty water tank. That we're looking for, as in the wasteland, we're looking for redemption. We're in this time period. We're looking for renewal, and I think we haven't talked about Dove and the body of Dove and his golden wrap in the mills in the seed from the mill. That is with the idea of the mill being an economic culprit, which is evoked throughout the story. But I hear it here in the flickers as the cock spread one wing, showing as a zebra's hide with a turn of his head that showed his red seal, when we've seen Dove like a seal breaking through a net of blood. The language evokes that. I'm thinking about Cheryl and all Cheryl's readings of birds in Welty, and I bet she's got something to say about this. But I'm just focusing on the damage in the garden, the sense of a world that is in damage rather than thriving. And then we have the image of Miss Marshall Pope believing that she was able to take care of herself. It doesn't make me feel confident. Yeah.
No, so I do love that wasteland imagery. This is not a hopeful ending. The Civil Rights Act has been passed. The Voting Rights Act has been passed, but these people have not changed, and there's not much hope for change in Dr. Strickland's heart. And his comfort comes when he retreats to the back of his house, when he's not hearing that cottonseed mill, when he's not hearing the gin, when he can't even hear the traffic whining. But he's got to go back out into the world. But even this retreat is focused on a wasteland. And I do think that cottonseed mill covering Dove is a telling detail. Died in service to that economy, the cotton economy. Yeah, economic servitude. Okay, Jessica, I know you're going to tell me we're out of time, so we can come back to this next time. We'll talk about all the works and their relationship to each other, and we can come back to the demonstrators then. And Susan, at the farmer's market on Saturday, raised a question about Frank X. Walker's work I want to take up next time too. So we'll come back to Turn Me Loose, and we'll talk about the interaction of the stories. Anything else? Anyone want a last word? All right, Jessica, you're the last word. Oh, Beverly, next to the last word, Jessica. Go, Beverly.
I think this is a good example of one more person looking away.
Yeah.
I mean, he's doing his job, but he's half-assed about it, and he's looking away.
Yeah. Cheryl.
Sorry, I'm laughing because Beverly and I interact on Facebook, and this is why, because she's outspoken. But
not Beverly.
Yes, Beverly. I wanted to encourage everyone who has bought the Frank X. Walker book on Amazon to go ahead and leave a review in support of him. That's all.
All right. Now, Jessica, now you get the last word.
Oh, just thank you everyone for your comments. This was a good discussion as always, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
More to come. Bye-bye.
Bye.